I had a couple of options here about how I would talk about the internet ecosystem and its effects, and I could have talked in fairly abstract terms, but I thought for a range of reasons it would be better to work through a practical, worked example. And I think I feel justified in this because in the previous session, my short presentation follows on very naturally with some of the themes we discussed then. So really, it's the example I'm going to use is content on phones, and let's talk about it as an evolutionary tale. We're going to have ecosystems, and the other things which go with ecosystems is phases of evolution, from Australopithecus through to hopefully Homo sapiens. So the 5 phases, I suppose, I want to talk about are, firstly, once upon a time, the prehistory. Then the second phase is phones get smarter and the carrier's first response to that. Then we'll move on to Chapter 3, which was mobile premium services go wild. Then we have after the iPhone. And finally, where next? And if I get time, and Richard, I'm sure will let me know if I do have time, we'll get to, hopefully, the moral of the story. So next slide, please. Would I try from here? Okay. Oh, sorry. All right, once upon a time. It's worth remembering with content on phones that this issue has been around in one form for a very long time. We had voice sex services and issues even in the old days of telephony and horoscopes and things like that. And we had great ways of controlling those as a regulator. You could put in access controls like PIN numbers. We required carriers to have PIN numbers. And our broadcasting regulator also had to regulate static websites and content on those. And in that world, you had big carrier payment platforms for these services. Now, one reason for mentioning this, which is very topical in Australia, was this very issue was one of the reasons why our government converged our 2 regulators. It's because our communications regulator, telecoms regulator, which was the one who did access controls, had their approach, and the broadcasting regulator came from the world of static websites, and they had their way of doing with it, and they couldn't agree on how to deal with content on phones. And so one of the government's responses was to say, well, we can't have this, having 2 regulators thinking about this differently, let's put them together, it's time. As we move into phase 2, so we're now at about 2003-ish. About this time, we've got SMS taking off big time, and as with SMS come a whole lot of new content offerings. The phones are starting to get smarter and do more things. Things like ringtones are really taking off. You're getting games and competitions and subscriptions and all sorts of things happening. And it's starting to turn into a serious multi-$100 million, if not billions of dollar industry. And also, thank you. The phones, the actual base of the user base is changing as well. So, I think you go from phones, so you're getting now a lot more phones out there, and it's almost becoming a basic teenager need. As we talk about USO, this is maybe a universal teenager service or something, in terms of having these mobile phones. And as we do that, the understanding also changes. The industry at this point sort of says, well, hold on, we can see you've got some issues, but trust us. This is an area where we, as an industry, have a collective interest in resolving the issues here because we've got a strategic interest in this market. We want to service our customers. So trust us. An industry collective solution is the way to go, industry self-regulation. And so they do, in fact, develop an industry approach, and we, as the authority, about 2005, register the new approach. So about the same time as the ink is drying on our first code is about the time when the complaints about these services absolutely take off. They start skyrocketing after 2006. The phones are, by this stage, getting much, much smarter, and those teenagers understand them, but their parents probably don't. But their parents are buying phones to give to their children, and the children are starting to buy services on those phones. So as a result, those complaints are soaring about issues like bill shock and associated hardship issues. Complaints handling is a very interesting issue, and customer service really take off during 2006 and 2007. And we as the regulator, probably take probably a little bit longer than we would have all liked, as does the industry, in terms of responding. The end result ended up by being a much better industry code than the first one. But we ended up by also putting in some regulation to support it, because the industry said, well, actually, we can't entirely resolve this issue ourselves. When it comes to dealing with small content providers and this complex supply chain, we can't actually always collectively deal with those issues. We need some help. We also put some rules on the carriers, of course, at the same time, just to make sure certain things got handled well. So you end up with a hybrid solution. And another thing we've done at the ACMA recently as well is to say, well, hold on, there's probably an underlying issue here as well that this has shown up, and that is the way the industry handles complaints and the whole reputation for customer service. Okay, next phase of the evolution is now about the same time as the ink was drying on that regulatory solution, we had another whole new development coming along, and it was the Apple iPhone, which was being talked about a lot. And obviously they have a completely different business model for this. Very slick device, but importantly, a completely different way of handling supply and the customer relationship. And the reason why the iPhone is so interesting from a regulator's point of view was the iTunes Store did a lot of things very well that we just wish that the mobile industry had done. It's very transparent. It tells you what the terms and conditions are. It tells you what things are going to cost. It's got very good ways of handling credit, and it's got good after-sales customer support. And we had that discussion in the last session about some of this, about how the mobile carriers sort of controlled a lot of content for maybe 5 years. And one of the questions I have is, well, why couldn't they have come up with a solution that was like that was good transparent, clear for consumers? And of course, their way of thinking about it is as a software. And they also stitched up a lot of the content before they even launched their service. So, all right, so now we're now in the iPhone phase, and the next question is, well, where does this go next in terms of the continuing evolution? And, well, that's obviously an open question. One of the things that we see in the ACMA is that these things could clearly evolve into a financial services delivery mechanism and device. And if it does that, if these phones do that, then and the services on them do that, then there are other bigger questions about who regulates them, to the extent the regulations required. Is it us? Is it our financial services regulators? There are obviously these devices have become hugely important for things like social networking, and user content is a big issue now. Will these phones become the internet access device of choice? Who intermediates content and services anyway? As I said before, those Apple and the Googles and others of this world clearly see managing the content relationship as being very important. And of course, there'll probably be a bunch of unknowns as well. All right, there's a long list of issues there, which maybe we might get to in the discussion. And in fact, I might come back and leave that list up there at the end of my short talk. Because I think we could talk through that, but that's probably 10 minutes on its own. We've got a bunch of levers that we as regulators can use, and I'll leave that slide in reserve. But I just want to get to what I think the moral of the story is. And I think one of the morals of the story is that from a regulator's point of view, industry, it's really in the industry's interest to get its act together. And I'm not sure that the mobile telecoms industry really did. And in a sense, if they can't get their act together, they will pay the price, I suspect, one way or another. Either they will be out-evolved in the market, and in some ways that's the cleanest way for things to happen. But if the market itself does not respond quickly enough, there will be inevitable political pressure for us as regulators to do something about it. I mean, the Apple iPhone came along at a particular time. If it hadn't, and the problem with mobile premium services had kept on getting worse, we would have been under huge pressure to have come up with much stronger regulation to deal with the problem. So I would be saying to industry generally, and maybe the telco sector in particular, you do need to think, you obviously think strategically about your business, but also it's very useful to think about what are the underlying regulatory issues, which things, and that's really partly a matter of thinking about, well, what do consumers actually want in terms of their interactions with you? As I said, I think Apple actually thought through that very carefully and actually nailed it very well. And as I said, I don't think the mobile industry as a whole did as good a job. And look, another little takeout from the moral of the story was that in some cases regulation can actually be helpful. One of the issues in my issues list is what I call the problem of the tail. Even if you get some of the industry players together who get it and who want to do the right thing, there's sometimes a problem with, you're going to sometimes have large numbers of other players in the market who may not want to do that, or who may have business cases which are deliberately exploiting other problems in the market as well. So, and in fact, one of our features of our mobile premium services system was what we called a do not contract rule, which the industry now has a register of content providers. The industry could not, for competition policy reasons, enforce that without us actually assisting. So, in a sense, the regulator had to essentially bless that sort of approach, in a sense, in terms of saying that a carrier could be required not to have a contract with certain known rogue content providers. Final moral of the story is that simplicity, I think, rather than complexity, is actually going to be maybe one of the keys for all of us in this. One thing I think with the telco business model in many cases, they talk about simplicity but actually develop very, very complex products. They have very complex pricing structures that sit underneath things. They'll often have a capped plan for a certain price, and then there'll all be all these complicated rules sitting in the system with complicated IT systems which actually generate the dollar value for certain numbers of minutes and so on. And I think that mentality is possibly what's potentially caused some of the issues here. So I think the successful providers in the internet ecosystem will be the ones who actually crack the simplicity problem. And to be perfectly honest, from a regulator's point of view, that's great because, as I said at the beginning, regulators ideally don't want to do anything. I mean, we would love to not be intervening in this market at all. We would love to see market mechanisms resolving things, but unfortunately we haven't been in that position to date. So there are some thoughts. Thank you.